actually written by Ash, and it was inspired by the message of Pope Francis for the 106th World Day of Migrants and Refugees on September 27th, 2020. Dear Lord, we ask for your grace to welcome and accompany those who are fleeing from the violence and persecution of their homelands. We find them detained in jails, languishing in refugee camps, and wandering outside of walls, fences, and guarded borders. In these desolate places, they plead for asylum within countries that could offer them security and peace. We ask that you help us to think of this population not as statistics, but as real people, each with his or her unique story. They are stories of people fleeing from hunger, war, and other grave dangers in search of security and a dignified life. They are stories of separation, children from parents, parents from each other, families by draconian laws and bureaucratic procedures. Help us to believe that as we encounter our migrant sisters and brothers, we will find your presence among them. Assure us that as we embrace the refugee, we will see your face, even though our eyes will find it hard to recognize you, your clothing in tatters, your body dirty, your tongue unable to speak our language. Tonight, as we gather on this Zoom to discuss how we might assist your migrant people, we pray that we might become for them your hands, feet, and voice, and in so doing, proclaim your greater glory and advance your kingdom on this earth. Amen.
Amen, amen. Nice.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you, Ash.
Thank you.
So I think Ash was also going to introduce you, Joanna, but we're just
actually David's going to.
Oh, David is. Okay, I'm sorry. Great. Thank you, David.
Okay, this is going to be really short. Hi, Joanna. Good to see you again. As you can tell, you are among admirers and friends and supporters. And most of what I was going to say has already been said in the pre-chat here, but I will add a couple of things. As I heard it, Joanna was selected after a nationwide search with many other qualified candidates, including experienced executive directors. But the cream rose to the top and she got the nod. And to some of us, myself included, it was a breathtaking moment that felt and feels like a watershed moment. And Joanna, we're here to hear what you have to tell us about what's going on at the border, what the challenges are, and they are many and mighty, and how we can help. Joanna, over to you. Thanks.
David, I don't think that I've ever gotten such a beautiful introduction, nor will I in the future, so I appreciate it. It's a beautiful consolation to spend my first day as executive director with all of you, knowing that I've journeyed with Holy Trinity for many years. I was actually, before I transitioned roles, I promised Jared, our new education coordinator, that I would download all of the information in my mind into some documents so that he didn't have to ask me as many questions. And I was looking back through the emails from when Margie first wrote me to request a visit with Holy Trinity, and that email about, well, we're partnering with the parish already in El Salvador, we want to understand the dynamics at the border. And I don't think when I got that request amongst so many requests, I could quite imagine what fruit would come from it. And so it's a joy to be with you and be part of this fruit and see how the work of the Migrant Committee or Migrant Team, I can't remember your official name, has continued to grow and transform into accompaniment and into advocacy and all of those different actions that we invite people to when they're in relationship with Kino. So my hope for this evening is I want to share a few updates from the ground here at KBI on primarily why are people arriving now? So the people who are arriving right now to the border, what are they sharing with us about their reasons for migration? How are US immigration policies affecting people right now at the border? And how KBI's work has changed. And then part of that is, as David already mentioned, what does that mean for the communities like Holy Trinity in terms of ways that you can become involved and be supportive? So I'll talk for a bit, and then I really want to have a dialogue with all of you and answer your questions and what's been coming up in your own work, your own context that I can help. I can't always give, well, I was gonna say can't always give an answer, but it's more so whenever you ask a question, I might give 5 answers to your question because of one of the words we focus on here is that it's very complicated. And we want that complication not to be paralyzing, but to be inviting, because it invites us to continue to ask those questions and be on this journey. So just to start off by sharing a little bit about why people are coming right now. I think one of the misnomers we have when we talk about migration is we pretend like the push factors always remain the same. So, of course, people are coming for reasons of violence or reasons of poverty. And the reality is that the news and dynamics of each particular year dramatically affect folks in the countries of origin. And I would say the strongest new trend that we're seeing this year, and by this year I mean in the last 3 months, is migration related to climate change, and specifically the hurricanes in Guatemala and Honduras. We actually had to add a new category to our intake survey to keep track of all of the people that were saying I came because the hurricane destroyed my home. And this is the hurricanes in the fall in Central America were on top of the already decimated economies because of the coronavirus. And that's something that people have expressed as well, is experiencing those 2 factors in their decision to displace. So just an example would be somebody who arrived last week to our comedor, was actually our now large migrant building center, but we call it the comedor still. So they arrived last week to our comedor from Honduras, and he had worked in a industry in Honduras that was reduced capacity because of coronavirus. So in the spring, he lost his job in that particular industry. He was relatively well off before that in Honduras. So he loses his 9-to-5 job as a manner of speaking, but he was still surviving and in some ways prospering with his family, because his family also had a small business on the side. And that's when the hurricane hit and destroyed his business. So it wasn't the first job loss that motivated him to leave, but it was the second destruction of his business. And the way that people that I've talked to, and I've talked to many people who have fled the hurricanes, they say, you know, I spent 15 years or 20 years or 25 years building up this house or this building or whatever it was. And I just can't bring myself to try to do that all over again. There's just a sense of desperation, and when I say desperation, a lack of hope that in their particular circumstance, it would be possible to return to what they had before the hurricane's destruction. So that's something that is underpinning a lot of the realities of folks who came from Honduras and from Guatemala. The young man who lost his job in the coronavirus and then lost his business, he said, I just don't want to hear my 7-year-old son cry anymore because he's afraid of going hungry. And this is a 7-year-old son that used to be in private school. He used to be in private school in an American school, and this dad had such great hopes for what his son would do, and now he's struggling to figure out how to feed him. So it's been night and day for some folks who thought that they were better off in the country. And the other dynamic that's I wouldn't say is new, but has resurfaced is people who are migrating to return to their family members in the United States. So we had 4 years of the Trump administration in which Immigration and Customs Enforcement was pretty indiscriminately deporting people who had family ties in the US. And even though the number of deportations didn't increase dramatically for a variety of reasons that you can ask me a question and we can go into a 10-minute discussion about. But the point is that there were no priorities in terms of who was being deported. It was just anyone that ICE encountered, Immigration and Customs Enforcement encountered. So that means we have a lot of folks now in Central America and in Mexico who have deep family ties in the US. And in this new moment of trying to migrate back to rejoin their family. So just this morning, I was talking to somebody who had been living for 16 years in the US. And 2 years ago, he was deported away from his 4 kids. And he just decided that this is the moment when he's going to try to reunite with that family. And we'll talk a little bit later about advocacy, but that's really a group that hasn't been contemplated by much policy, by policymakers writ large. So a lot of folks are focusing on what will happen to people who are undocumented within the United States, but very few are thinking about those who have already been affected by deportation and who are trying to get back to family members within the US. And then the third dynamic, which is, I would say has been consistent, though ever changing over the course of the last several years, is people who are continuing to arrive because of displacement due to violence. We continue to receive a lot of people from Venezuela and from Cuba who are fleeing political persecution, as well as a few Nicaraguans, so I'd say we aren't receiving as many people from Nicaragua right now. We are receiving Hondurans and Guatemalans who are speaking about violence as a reason for migration. And there's two dynamics I've heard about recently. One was just this morning, so one's a little bit more on the political persecution spectrum. So there was a young man this morning, well, not so young actually, but maybe a middle-aged man this morning who was a leader in his community. So he led his community organization that was trying to fight for the rights of his particular town. And it was because of that activism that he was targeted not just by the gangs, but also by the central government because of this increase in corruption and problematic governance in Central America. We've seen a lot of murders of human rights defenders in Central America in the recent months and the last year. And that he fled because he didn't want to be one of those statistics as a human rights defender. And then the other dynamic of violence that has been continuous but has also been affected by the coronavirus is individuals who were being extorted by the gangs in Central America, so in Honduras or Guatemala or El Salvador. And the gangs continued to extort them at the same rate when the economy fell due to coronavirus. So a lot of people who were paying those extortion payments, I was speaking to one man who'd been paying extortion to the gangs for over 5 years, and all of a sudden he was no longer able to make those payments and started to receive additional threats on that basis. That's really hard. I'm going to speak briefly about the changes in the asylum system, but even in our asylum system 6 years ago, was very difficult for these folks to qualify, people who are fleeing because of gang-based extortion, and now it's all the more impossible. So those are some of the situations of the people who are arriving at the border that we're seeing the motivations for migration. And folks have been affected by some policies that remain unfortunately very similar to what we saw since the 1990s, and others that are just recent in the last year or 2 years. So many of the people who are arriving to the border aren't necessarily looking to seek asylum. As I mentioned, there's a lot of people who are displaced by climate change, other folks for economic reasons are trying to get back with their families. And for them, they're not thinking about access to the asylum system. They don't have any legal possibility to access the asylum system the way it's set up. So they're trying to cross through the desert between ports of entry and make it around Border Patrol to try to make it into the United States. And the other individuals who are trying to arrive to seek asylum have seen that right to access to asylum deteriorate in the last couple of years. So it was a little over 2 years ago that MPP, which Margie put in the chat, and I will talk about the status and reality of MPP. It was about a little over 2 years ago that the US government started returning people to Mexico to wait for their court dates in the United States. And it was a year and 2 months ago that program started in Nogales. So many asylum seekers who weren't from Mexico were being returned to Nogales, whether they were from Nicaragua or Venezuela or Honduras, had to come back to Nogales and were waiting for a court date in El Paso when the pandemic hit. But they were still processing many asylum seekers into the United States. And then in mid-March, in mid-March of last year, so almost a year ago this month, the Trump administration invoked what's called Title 42 of the CDC code. And Title 42 allows the government, or the government believes that it allows them, to exclude people on the basis of a threat to public health. And so that means that in the way that it's been presented, which is a misnomer, is that the border is closed. The reality is that the border is very much open, and that I cross the border multiple times a week. There are still millions of people who are crossing the border. The border is closed to so-called non-essential travel. So me going across the border, or somebody from the US traveling to get dentistry work done in Nogales, is considered essential travel. Whereas people who are fleeing for their lives, like this man from Honduras who is being extorted, or the Guatemalan human rights defender, they're not considered essential travelers. So they're being excluded under Title 42 of the CDC order. And in essence, what that means is that there's essentially no access to asylum for people who are fleeing violence. So anybody who goes up to a port of entry and says, I'm afraid, and this is a question that Mario put in the chat, are people surrendering themselves or crossing, are they being sent to immigration detention? Whether they present at the port or whether they cross between the ports of entry, by and large, Border Patrol is just immediately returning them back to Mexico under Title 42. And so that means Guatemalans, Hondurans, Salvadorans, some Nicaraguans, and I'll talk a little bit, there's some complexity when it comes to Venezuelans and Cubans and Nicaraguans. But we are receiving more and more people who are arriving in Nogales and it's a city they've never been in. They oftentimes are being returned in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, 11 p.m. Just a couple weeks ago, we had a mom from El Salvador who was 8 months pregnant and traveling with her kid, who was returned to Nogales at 11 p.m. Even though we at Kino worked for years and years and years to restrict the hours of deportation, and those of you who've come down on the Kino trips, you may have heard my speech on this, that it was one of the few signs of positive advocacy that they're restricting the hours of repatriation because it's so dangerous at night in Nogales. But the US government claims that these aren't repatriations, they're just expulsions. And so therefore the fact that they're not allowed to repatriate people at 11 p.m. doesn't stop them from expelling them at 11 p.m. So it's been a discouragement for us as advocates, but more importantly, I think it's had a really devastating effect on people at the moment of arrival and just their level of vulnerability in the city of Nogales. So we have people who are arriving every day in this situation who are being expelled at all hours of the day. And then there's also folks who have been in Nogales since over a year ago, who were intending to seek asylum and then were affected by this Title 42 order or were affected by MPP. And what they're living is this prolonged limbo of they've already been waiting for over a year. And we had a protest last month where people wrote down on a sheet of paper how many days they'd been waiting. It was 450 days, 500 days. And there's a video, actually, I'll put it in the chat. I was thinking about showing it to you, but I'll spend my time talking to you so you can watch the video later. There's a video that speaks about what's the impact of one more day. Because it's easy for the Biden administration to say, well, we're trying to restore asylum, we're working as hard as we can, just wait a few more days. But for the families who are in Nogales, one more day is, as you'll hear in the video, it's another day of being uncertain whether their kids are safe. It's another day of their kids being out of school. We received a Cuban family just a couple of weeks ago, who the mom was a teacher, and she came in tears to our aid center. She'd been trying so hard to get her kids registered in school in Nogales, Sonora, because she was just so afraid of what would happen if her kids missed out on a year of school. And the family, this might sound similar to some of what's happening in the US, it's just exacerbated. So it was a family with 3 kids and they had 1 cell phone. And she managed to register one of her kids in school. And so that teacher was sending homework through the cell phone so that the kid could try to do that, but he didn't know how to do his homework. And then the schools wouldn't accept her other kids. And she was distressed about what impact that would be. So that's the limbo that people have been in. And in that context then, well, the one other piece I'll mention about this limbo, and I mentioned people who are crossing between ports, because there's no access to asylum, a lot of asylum seekers are also trying to get into the United States by going around Border Patrol, by trying to avoid inspection and make it to the US. And that's, I think, one of the strong reasons that we've seen one of the higher death tolls in Arizona of people crossing the border, because people who would have otherwise turned themselves in are instead trying to go into more remote areas. And so in 2020, we saw a big increase in remains recovered in the desert, because people are trying to choose between will they risk their life by moving, or will they risk their life by staying? And into this context of limbo, there's a lot of ways that we can that it's a challenge and it's a weight for these families, but it's also created certain opportunities for better accompaniment, I think, from the Kino Border Initiative's side. And for those of you who have been to Kino in the past, I don't even know if you would recognize Kino in the present, just in terms of how our work has changed, and not just because of the pandemic. I think there's a lot we could say about how the pandemic stops us from doing X, Y, and Z, but I actually think I'm more encouraged and more focused on what we have been able to do in this year. We've been able to launch the Livelihoods Project, which is a project that accompanies people who are settling in Nogales, Sonora, and helps them find jobs. And the Victor, who's in charge of this project, he'll give them a suit, or not a suit, but whatever kind of clothing is appropriate for their interview, and he'll help them prep for their interview, and he will identify employers to help them get jobs, and also accompany them along that journey of employment and the challenges and opportunities they might find. So we're much more oriented towards that longer term support, towards more of a resettlement situation than a transitional situation at the moment. And what that's meant for our advocacy, and I think this is really the most beautiful grace in the midst of a lot of darkness, is that we used to do advocacy where we were really, we as people, staff of KBI, were representing the voices of people at the border. I would hear a story and then I would share that story with a congressional office, or we would decide as KBI staff, what are we going to do to advocate on behalf of people? But since we have so many people who have been here for over a year, we're at this point where they're really leading our advocacy. We're convening meetings and they're saying, well, this is what I want Kino to do, or this is what we should organize. This is the protest that I want to lead, and this is how I want this is where I want to share my story. So it's been a really inspiring for us as KBI staff to be led by our migrant brothers and sisters, and not just be advocating on their behalf. And to see also over the course of this year how people have grown in their leadership. One of the voices that you'll hear in that video is a woman who hasn't wanted to participate publicly in the protests, but she wanted her story to be told in some form, and she decided that the best way to do that was to share it in this video. So there's different ways that people are engaging in advocacy. And so our focus has been, right now, our main advocacy campaign is Not One More Day. So focusing on what that impact is of one more day of wait. And that's something that migrants have shared with us and encouraged us in. And since the Biden administration, so that's the context up until January 21st. Since the Biden administration has come into power, they've made several promises related to access to asylum in executive orders. They've said that they're going to investigate, review all of these different policies. The substantive change that they've made is that they've reopened processing for people who are under MPP. So those people who were returned to Mexico to wait for their US court dates are now going to have the opportunity to present again at the border, and in this case be released. And this is another part of your question, Mario. In this case, they could actually be released into the United States and not held in detention, but fight their asylum cases from within the US. It's going to take a long time. The people returned to Nogales were some of the last people returned under MPP. So they're also in the last they're the last in the line of people who will be brought into the country again. But we're spending a lot of time trying to just inform people, help them sign up for the platform. The Florence Project, which is a partner organization that provides legal services. We have an MOU where KBI provides some funding to Florence Project for legal representation in Nogales. And they've increased their in-person presence and actually hired another legal assistant so that we can have orientations every single day. But that's changed, so that's an important change. It's substantial for some people's lives, and it's also meaningless for a lot of other people's lives, because anyone that's not under MPP is not affected at all by this policy. And I think going back to this beauty of organizing is that it has been beautiful for me to watch how there's solidarity across nationalities and across people in different circumstances. That if we didn't have that base that we've been building up for over a year, it would have been very easy for this announcement to have divided the community in Nogales, because certain people are winning, certain people are getting access to benefits and other people are being left behind. And instead, what I've heard and what's inspired me is from people who have MPP, who are going to be eligible, they're saying, this is all the more motivation for me to fight tirelessly for you, Esmeralda from Guerrero, who doesn't qualify, or all of the other friends that they made in this journey of building an advocacy movement. But ultimately, it's difficult for people to make decisions right now at the border because they have such little information. So people under MPP know a little bit about what their course of action is, but people in any other circumstance who are trying to seek asylum simply don't know what the process will look like. And so one of the actions that we took as KBI is we, about a month ago, around a month ago, we sent a letter to Secretary Mayorkas, so Department of Homeland Security Secretary Mayorkas, and we detailed all of the complaints that we filed over the course of the last 4 years, including 6 complaints under the Biden administration. We think it's important that this new administration doesn't come in and say, oh, we have a clean slate. We're just gonna take action that as if nothing has happened in the past. We said, here's all of the complaints. We've only heard back on 14 of these 73, so we'd like to hear some answers to the rest of the complaints of where's the investigative status. Also, we'd like you to change these policies that are creating harm, that are making us have to file complaints. But most importantly, what we asked for in that letter was for Secretary Mayorkas to schedule a meeting with migrants at the border, that he meet with the folks in Nogales to hear about their situation and also to share with them about what's the plan. What details can he give people who are in this void of information? And so we sent that letter to him several weeks ago. We received, I wouldn't say it's a form response, but we received a pretty vague response from an assistant secretary of DHS saying, thanks so much for the letter, we're gonna look into your concerns. And so what we've decided to do, and Holy Trinity has already, I believe, agreed to participate in this according to my emails, is that on March 10th, we're escalating to a banner day of action where communities in Arizona, but also now around the US, including Holy Trinity, are going to put up banners in support of the Save Asylum movement. And then we're inviting people on March 11th to call the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security and reiterate our request that Secretary Mayorkas meet with migrants at the border. But in this planning process, I think this is also, again, the uniqueness of being led by migrants in Nogales, Sonora. The migrants in Sonora asked each person to call on behalf of one of the people who's stranded in Nogales. So we're compiling different stories, and what we're asking people to do is call and say, I'm Margie, I'm a parishioner at Holy Trinity, and I'm calling on behalf of Elena, and to say a sentence about Elena's experience. And then will Secretary Mayorkas commit to meeting with Elena and other migrants in Nogales? So that's March 11th, that's our call-in day of action that follows the banner day of action. And that's a way for you to get involved in the very short term. And I think the other suggestion that like to make, and I think you at Holy Trinity are this is a strength that you have, and Ash has already demonstrated this today. But we're also asking people to pray in the next 10 days in the lead up to this day of action, to be praying for individuals, and to the extent that you can, watching this video, for example, and pray for the 3 people who speak in this video. So I think the more particular and more personal that we can accompany in prayer, the stronger that we can be in community, and really the more consoling it is to folks in Nogales, Sonora, who are at once animated by these actions and by their own advocacy, and at the same time we're always teetering on the edge of desperation because their circumstances aren't getting better, despite all of their tireless work. So that was, I covered a sweep of history and geography. I think I answered a couple of questions in the chat. Let me see. Oh, Margie is reminding me that I skipped the basic KBI introduction. Ashley told me that I didn't have to give it. I'll give the basic KBI introduction though. I'm sorry for.
Well, we can send the link too. So I mean, I think people may have other questions, but I mean, you can give the 1 minute soundbite if you like. Sorry, I didn't mean to tell you couldn't highlight KBI.
I have to practice for my executive director elevator speech, So KBI we're a binational Jesuit organization, and we try to respond to the reality of migrants in Nogales, Mexico. We do through humanitarian aid, so that includes food, it includes clothing. More recently, it includes a psychologist who's assisting people as of a couple months ago. And even more recently, as of a few days ago, we've opened our shelter space to people in situations of extreme vulnerability. So a limited number of women and women with children. We'd had that closed during the coronavirus. But we also respond to the needs of folks in Nogales through education, such as the Holy Trinity trips, and through advocacy in the US and in Mexico. And we're really building up some of our Mexican advocacy right now. And our Mexican attorney is actually now the coordinator of the advocacy dimension for the Jesuit Migration Network in Mexico. So he's coordinating nationwide efforts to change policies in Mexico, since many people are affected by extortion or detention while they're in Mexico. So that was a little bit longer than the 1 minute, but I get excited about the new developments because I know even those of you who are familiar with KBI probably didn't know we had a psychologist, and certainly didn't know that we'd opened our shelter space. Ashley, do you want to ask me questions?
Yeah, no, I think Jean was going to facilitate the chat.
Oh, Jean is, okay.
Yeah.
I do. Sorry about that. I was just trying to get all the questions. I actually have a question on the campaign. Is it a campaign that you see as being that focused? So it'll be like, 1 day of like putting up the banner on March 10th and then March 11th, making the calls, and then it's finished, or is there, are there other pieces to it? Just around the logistics.
Yeah, so we oftentimes build planes while we fly them. So there will probably be other pieces to the campaign. This campaign dates back to the last summer. We've had different actions. I'd actually encourage you to go back. I think the most moving one, and Ignatian Solidarity Network has helped us with the technology back end. But in October, we had a children seeking asylum march, where it was children who were the ones speaking about their own experience. And that, and I watch have a lot of moving experiences here in Nogales, but I think that one was particularly touching. So we've been building up by these in-person actions, and this campaign is pivoting a strategy with the new administration. We had a march the eve of the administration, then the letter that we sent to Mayorkas, now the banners, and now the call-in day. And if we don't get a response from Secretary Mayorkas, which I hope we do, and I hope that we can have this meeting, but if we still don't get a response, then we'll look at what's the next step that we could escalate to. Is that going to be more in-person actions, for example? So we don't know exactly what that would look like, but certainly we're going to keep advocating until the Department of Homeland Security gives us a good reason not to.
That's great. That's wonderful. Okay, so we have a bunch of questions. I think you talked about the border, who can cross and who can't. I guess one of the questions from Margie is, what are your immediate needs for the people who come to them? So like the baby blankets that have a lot of parishioners here have been doing, what are some of the needs that you have? Like let's talk first at the border, and then we can talk afterwards about, what our parish can do here locally.
Sure. Well, I've been giving out lots of blankets, so I appreciate that. I've also been giving out some of my daughter's clothing to other kids, which is particularly moving and distressing, because I can't even imagine. I was barely functional a month after giving birth, let alone traveling across multiple borders like some people have, because we have had 1 month-olds here. But I would say that in terms of material supplies, what we most need are backpacks. We need some medication, like we're seeing a lot of pregnant women, so prenatal vitamins that we could give to pregnant women. The other day I was mixing a cocktail of all the different ingredients that go into prenatal vitamins and trying to put them in small bags to give to folks, since we didn't actually have prenatal vitamins in stock at that time. That sounds worse than it was. They were all simple things like iron and vitamin C. I was just trying to distribute them accordingly. And I think some of the items are a little bit bigger that make more sense to donate here, like shoes or jeans, but those are the constants. We're getting out of winter weather, so we don't need as much winter clothing. I know it's still very cold, I'm sure, in DC, but today was kind of our last gasp of winter weather. So we're moving more towards summer.
That's good. I was going to say, if you've ever got a list, Ashley is pretty amazing at putting Sign Up Genius, and we have so many parishioners that's their way to help, but they love knowing that they're buying something going to, so please let us know and we could get that. So thank you. Let's see, has KBI taken a role in family reunification?
So we've been following the development of the committee that the Biden administration set up. We at KBI, we're not in touch with families that have been separated, but what we see our role is because we're involved with the Jesuit Migration Network, we're trying to do a good job of being the bridge between what's happening in the US and what are our Jesuit partners in Central America, for example, seeing. So communicating information to them. Right now we don't see an opportunity for them to participate in this committee because the committee is still being formed, or task force I think is what it's called, but it's still being formed and it's a little unclear how they're going to be in touch with folks in Central America. But we're following those developments closely so that at the appropriate moment we could call the folks in Guatemala or in Honduras and plug them into that effort, since they're the ones that really are better positioned to identify the separated families, since many of them are in their country of origin now.
That's great. David Christian wanted to ask, I think this is a nice little plug for you, about your upcoming KPI fundraiser.
Oh, thank you, David. You got to see me on my first day as executive director, but my true public coming out is on March 21st. We have a virtual fundraiser, and that'll be the goodbye to Father Sean and the welcome to me as executive director. If you want to hear what's my vision for KBI, then you should sign up as a sponsor and join us on March 21st in the afternoon. And you can, if you go to the Keno Border Initiative homepage, the link is right there. So thank you, David, for helping me in my fundraising roles. I mean, in all seriousness, I cared about fundraising before, but I think what's extraordinary for me working at Keno is just the incredible variety of work that we can do. So the fact that we have now a psychologist on staff, and the fact that we have a job placement program, all of that is thanks to people who are making generous individual donations that give us the flexibility to respond to the moment. So I've always valued that a lot, but I think in my current role, I see that extraordinary generosity even more closely.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, let's see. This is from Dennis. When traveling becomes feasible, are there advantages to the KBI migrant program for people like us to go physically to the border as opposed to staying home and doing whatever we can from home?
It's a great question, Dennis. And for us, it's what's important is the both and. The advantage of going to the border that we've seen at Holy Trinity, but in other communities, is that it can give you a perspective on the work that's happening in DC. So it not just when I say perspective, it's not just information, because you can get lots of information by reading books, but it's a sense of the emotion of that moment that allows you to better accompany folks in DC. And that's actually the reason that I went to Kino in the first place a decade ago, is that I was accompanying migrants in Chirilagua in the Arlandria neighborhood of Northern Virginia. And I said, it's one thing to be here and be present with these families, but they're talking about crossing the border and they're thinking about deportation and they're thinking about their family that's on the journey. And for me to be a better friend and ally to them, I want to understand that piece. So I think you all can be better friends and allies and accompaniers to migrants in the DMV area by understanding this piece of their journey. That's really a very raw moment along the journey.
Ashley built on, but what about virtual immersion opportunities?
We are doing virtual immersions. And I'd credit Tracy Horan on our staff, who's incredibly creative. She's also the leader of this migrant organizing movement. She, within a few weeks, well, I suppose about a month and a half after everything shut down in the pandemic, she developed a virtual immersion curriculum. And I have to be honest, that I was not particularly optimistic about the virtual immersions when we launched them, because there's such importance to being present with folks physically in terms of that relationship building. And so I thought the virtual immersions were a good thing to kind of pass the time while we waited for the pandemic to be over. And I've been, I think, proven wrong. There's been a lot of grace in the virtual immersions, folks who have shared that they do feel a sense of presence and connection. And I think especially at this moment where we don't have a lot of volunteers, and because of the pandemic, there's the folks who are in Nogales are feeling very forgotten by the US. And for them to connect virtually, that's been powerful as well. To say, okay, there's not someone physically present here, but here's this community that's fighting for me in Chicago or in San Francisco or in those other cities that we've connected virtual immersions to. And we've also been able to adapt it a little bit to the current moment. So we have, for example, we're able to bring in folks who have come through KBI and are now in the US to share about their experience of that. I think you all could write a book on this, so some of you might not necessarily need that part as much, but it's been a beautiful way for us to stay in relationship with people after their experiences in Nogales as well. And by that I mean the migrants who have come through as well as the groups. So that's certainly an option for folks to consider.
That's great, thank you. Dennis, Lucy, do you want to speak real quick? You had a question?
Hi, thank you so much. Joanna, congratulations on your new position. That's a toughie there, you know. Two quick questions. People give to people, I noticed. They don't necessarily give to causes. Could you, number one, tell us a little bit about your background, where you went to school and where you're from and how you got down to this organization? And the second question I'm really interested in is, what is your annual budget, and how much of that is raised through contributions? So Joanna, those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, so I have lots of roots very close to Holy Trinity. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado, and that's where I first got to know immigrants. I had in middle school friends who were from Mexico, and I didn't really understand what it meant to be documented or undocumented at the time. It was only later on that I realized that some of my friends' parents were undocumented. But I also tutored refugees in English when I was a high school student in Denver. I went to Georgetown University, like many Georgetown University freshmen, with the intention of saving the world and changing all of the political circumstances that forced people to leave. But that community that I mentioned in Chirilagua or Arlandria, Virginia, really invited me into this journey of more humble accompaniment. Their vision, Casa Chirilag was the organization, their vision is learning to love our neighbor as ourselves. And so I got to know folks who had been in a journey of migration. I got to hear their stories, care about them, and start to ask questions about what would it look like for me to take the next step in this journey of loving my neighbor. So in 2011, I went down to the Kino Border Initiative for the first time. As I mentioned, very much with the intention of coming back to DC and living in DC for the rest of my life, which is still an option I always entertain. But there was a rawness to that moment of being present in Nogales, just trying to, again, learn to love my neighbor in a new way every day, to hold the grief of the moment and the rawness, also the intimacy of the relationships, because everything's laid bare here in Nogales. And so when I left KBI, and I thought that I was leaving for the last time, and I was devastated. I mean, I remember I went on spiritual exercises the week after I left, and I just was sobbing and sobbing and sobbing, thinking I've left a part of myself at the border. And what will my life look like? How can I go back to Georgetown and care about anything that Georgetown students care about? And it took me several years, at Georgetown and post Georgetown, to realize that God's call was to be present in Nogales. As one of my mentors said, if God wants you to just go to the border and love people for the rest of your life, that's not a waste of your gifts and talents, Joanna. And that was advice from one of my mentors that really freed me to listen to the Spirit and feel that tug again towards Nogales. So I started back here in 2015, and that was where I grew to appreciate the work of KBI specifically. So not just this moment that we exist in at the border, but the multidimensionality of our work, because now I wasn't just in humanitarian aid, but I was in education and advocacy. And that's where I began to understand, well, what does it look like to be present with people, but also working towards structural change? And so I feel deeply committed to KBI's mission. I think it's unique amongst organizations at the border. I think it's incredibly challenging and impossible to navigate, but that's part of the beauty of it, is that we're on this journey of navigating complexity. And you asked me a second question, Dennis. I got caught up in my own story. Our budget. And so our budget is $1.5 million annually. We've grown significantly really since we've opened a new center and expanded staff. And the vast majority of that is through individual contributions. So grants make up about 5% of our budget. Most of it is individual donors who are giving generously. When I was at Georgetown, I gave $10 a month to KBI as just I want to be faithful in what this organization has offered to me. Now I'm in a position to give more, and I'm also thankful for other people who are in a position to give more than that, because it allows us, as I said, to have that staff presence that many organizations at the border can't have.
Thank you. Okay, I'll have one big question, and then I'll start wrapping up. What's the biggest challenge you're facing right now?
I think this is sort of an existential challenge to folks who accompany migrants writ large, but it was easy for folks under the Trump administration to be aware of folks at the border. President Trump spent a lot of time thinking and talking about people at the border. And so it was similarly easy to rally support. And folks who wanted there to be justice or wanted to fight for dignity felt a particular call towards the work in Nogales, the work of KBI, both from an advocacy perspective as well as from a financial perspective. And now we're going to be out of the headlines, or we're somewhat out of the headlines. It depends on the moment, but the injustices continue, and the circumstances that people are in haven't changed substantially. And so I think the challenge that we face now is reminding people of this ongoing reality, creating spaces in which migrants' voices can be heard, and communicating that this work that we do at the border is still critical. and still needs to grow, even though there's a new president. So that's, I don't have a clear answer to that. I think we're planning on being just as persistent and tireless in advocacy as we were under the Trump administration, but we can't do it alone. And we need folks in DC, we need folks in other places to continue to persist with us if we're gonna truly work to create change and promote humane and just policy here.
Thank you. That's great. So I just wanted to recap that it sounds like what we can help you with is prayer, which we will continue to do. This campaign, which you saw, we have Ashley got a banner, which I'll send to everybody so that you can see it, and it'll be hung, and we'll work on that advocacy campaign. And also please continue to, we're trying to get our advocacy up and running, and the more focused way that we can directly make an impact is going to help guide us. That would be great. Also, these individual things like the blankets and the vitamins and anything else, please let us know, as well as like us being part of your network. David Christian made a really good point, and I'm reflecting on, a couple years ago when Bruce and I were part of one of the keynote groups, is when we came back, and that's when we got the call about our beautiful Mario, who's on this call. And then since Mario, you also talked to David about Freddie Sevilla, and now we've got the entire extended Sevilla family. We now have 8 families actually that we're accompanying and help supporting and being with. It's just blossomed, and it's blossomed from a few of us to a very big community, and that's all because of KBI. So we're very grateful for that inspiration and the connection, and thank you.
Well, it's inspiring for us too. When folks come on immersions, we're always encouraging, take action afterwards, live out solidarity. But to see that really come to fruition reminds us that our work is meaningful and it's worth it. Mm-hmm. And so thank you all. And I spent a lot of time with Freddie, so I visited him in detention. So it's good to know that he has friends with him still in DC and Virginia.
Yeah, that's, well, thank you so much. Well, we promised that you would get back to your baby at 8 o'clock. So I'm going to go ahead.
Right on time, my baby's coming in the door.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to let Margie do the closing prayer, and everybody, thank you so much. We've got a recording, and I've been taking notes, and we'll do the next step. We'll get going. Thank you. Go ahead, Margie.
Thank you for facilitating, Jean.
Great. Can we see the baby first?
Just a second. Matt, you want to bring Teresa over?
This is Teresita. Oh, wow. Oh, hello, baby.
It's Teresa Gabriela, so she's named after Teresa of Avila, Therese de Lisieux, and Saint Teresa of Calcutta. She's got lots of options for education.
Beautiful.
Oh, she's beautiful. Hello, baby.
You want to pray with us, Teresa?
Baby.
We're going to do some prayer?
Is she bilingual?
Beautiful
Sí,
baby.
también habla español.
Okay. All right.
Beautiful Teresa.
Are we, Jean, are we ready for the prayer?
Yes.
Yes, please, Margie, go ahead.
Okay. Okay, well, this prayer was actually written by Mary Gibbons, who was part of our Keynote 1 trip in October 2017, when she led one of our evening reflection periods. And it's a prayer that has stayed with me from that time on. As we encounter and accompany our neighbors to the south, help us repurpose the story once told in response to the question, who is my neighbor? Help us recall that the title character of that parable, the Samaritan who did good, was a foreigner on hostile ground, and that he was the rescuer, not the rescuee. To recap, As a man lay bloodied and abandoned, his compatriots passed by. And then someone stopped. A stranger with roots in a sect reviled in the battered man's land. Yet it was he, the alien arrival, who salved the man's wounds with balm from his flask, who tore his own clothes to bandage his limbs, who transported him to refuge on his donkey, the first century Palestinian SUV of choice. Help us cherish the stranger on roads made rough in our own time. Help us know the gifts borne by those traveling to and through, and those cast away from our own at times hostile land. Help us discern the grace each new neighbor conveys as he refines the calloused edges of our culture, as she reminds us of our values, as they illuminate the universal countenance of vivid human goodness that lets us see the face of God anew. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Margie. Joanna, I have to tell you, before you spoke, we had a Women Who Stay series, and Megan Clark, a theologian, spoke. And you were the perfect example of what she talked about, because she talked about becoming neighbor. And she talked about not asking what would Jesus do, but what would you do to and for Jesus. And so thank you. I mean, it was wonderful to have you here tonight, and then to have that connection with what Megan was talking, and to see it in action. So
Thanks for the
we are glad to be
encouragement.
on this journey with you, and call us anytime.
I will take you up on that. I'm so thankful for the journey. I'm looking forward to bringing Teresa out there to meet you all in DC whenever travel's safe.
Excellent. Excellent.
All right,
Thank you,
you, everybody.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Margie
Anna.
and
Thank
Jean,
you,
for
Tino.
making it
Thank you
happen.
so much.
And thank you, Ash.
Abrazos a todos.
We'll see you at our next meeting next Monday. If you
Okay.
want to learn
Monday,
more,
guys.
just let Jean or me know.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Bye.
Bye.